Professor Emerita at Memorial University of Newfoundland, Beverley Diamond is one of Canada's and the world's most distinguished, most productive, and most forward-looking ethnomusicologists. Her pioneering academic career now touches half a century in duration, and Bev began young. The first publication of hers I could locate is an annotated bibliography in the journal Ethnomusicology, volume 16 of 1972. This is followed by in-depth analysis of Inuit song and singing. Bev, that was the first work of yours that I came across as a somewhat lost PhD student, looking for direction just up the road from here in Belfast. You produced a thoughtful series of studies of hymn singing as transcultural practice. I wished I found that work earlier. And then path-breakingly ethical, sensitive, collaborative work on Indigenous musical instruments in the remarkable Visions of Sound. Perhaps it felt urgent and even obvious to you, but looking back, this book seems so far ahead of its time. Or maybe this time lag is a mark of how academic ethnomusicology, despite its best intentions, can lose touch with the very people whom we claim to champion. And then we need work like this to remind us to seek out and work with those around us once again. Resting on laurels wasn't for you. Instead, you authored contributions that reshaped Canadian music history. You were writing global history well before that term reached music studies. On music and gender, your eyes, ears, and heart were turned and tuned toward practices of relationality, when for many that was a nice idea but not a methodological stance. In work like this, you taught me that a good question is sometimes even better than a good answer. An answer might explain something well and so satisfy my English male, not very male, desire for authority. But a great question takes us forward to new concerns and new interlocutors. It points towards the things we don't already know. I see curiosity as fundamental to your approach. It's a curiosity that accepts being in a state of not yet understanding, which is to say it's inherently respectful of difference. Or perhaps I should say, what more could I learn by attempting to emulate your combination of critically insightful investigations, humane attention to the needs of those around you, and generosity of interpretation. But let me pause there, because I've only got to Y2K, and I've only mentioned publications. I've not said a word about teaching, mentoring, and at least two of Bev's former advisees are here, and both thoroughly successful academics in their own right. Or public and institutional service. I've not mentioned your awesome gold medal from the Canada's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Your fondness for cats. Or the way you know how to carry a wayward co-editor smoothly to the end of a complex project. And those letters who could be related. In fact, I don't need to go on through all your recent work, because you're going to reflect on questions of impact in a moment anyway. Everyone here is anxious to hear your stories of EMMA, the Centre for Music, Media and Place, perhaps of the Women's Accordion Circle, of the divergent yet coherent vectors of First Nations and Sami indigeneity and contemporaneity, of music technology, broadcasting and archiving, of multiculturalism and its erasures, of diversity as fluid but contested, of truth, reconciliation, justice and refusal. Whether a president can see change in the juggernaut that is the Society for Ethnomusicology, or of the whole Transforming Ethnomusicology initiative, one key step of which took place just over the way in Limerick, of course. Dear guests, visitors, colleagues, students, friends, it is my profound honour and delight to introduce an ethnomusicologist from whom I've learnt a huge amount and simultaneously far too little. Her keynote is entitled Spaces of Impact. Please join me in welcoming Professor Beverley Diamond.
Well, you've heard the best part of the talk. Thank you, Jonathan, for your very kind and overly generous words. And I must say that after hearing such wonderful music and with a wall of various auspicious men behind me, this is kind of a daunting task. However, I'm delighted to be with you, and my title slide should really have got the title correct. It was Spaces of Impact that I should have written there when I did that all too hurriedly a few nights ago. So, when Jonathan contacted me about this conference, he spoke of impact as ripples that resulted from attitudes and actions, etc. While the academic literature on impact is mostly focused on the positive aspects, association with advancement, achievement, assessment, for instance, my first thoughts triggered by the conference theme were more negative. I first thought of impact as destructive strength, the impact of two cars colliding, for instance, or as sneakier and slower processes that happen within and beyond the human community, as in the impacts of contemporary urban life on climate change. Whether negative or positive, and I'll return to the importance of taking the negative seriously, the concept is also complicated by other factors. For example, whom we consider to have an impact. Teachers and others who shape learning, of course, but equally germane is how impact relates to recipients as well as instigators of action. Finally, I will urge us to think about impact beyond human societies to include all forms of life. I've opted to consider some varied spaces of impact that I've encountered, or in some cases created. Well, in the last 20 years, I've done many collaborative projects with both settler and Indigenous communities. I've opted to look at the trajectories of my work since the last decades of the last century, when for me, each project seemed to emerge from the problems and questions raised by the project that preceded it. In other words, this whole structure of this talk today is a little exercise in impact. Each succeeding topic was impacted by what came before, of course. I start with community-based fieldwork when I was young and foolish, and then consider studies of colonial institutions, particularly museums. I'll reflect briefly on intercultural colloquia that I organized with the aim to deepen the dialogue between settler and Indigenous scholars about issues of mutual concern, the misfit of copyright, for instance. Those dialogues, in part, led me to reflect on spaces of learning that may constrain or free our thinking, speaking, and writing. And emerging from those dialogues, I'll briefly reference the burgeoning of an Indigenous recording industry. It's an ambitious agenda, but what fascinates me is how one thing leads to or impacts the next. Fieldwork spaces, fearing impact. I'm going to start with some reflections on my earliest fieldwork, since fearing the impact I might have on a culture about which I had so much to learn was part of that story for me, and perhaps for everyone who starts new research in places and with people previously unknown or known relatively little. I'm of a generation that was taught in the early 1970s that collecting was a central ethnomusicological enterprise. We've changed our views on that a little bit. I studied Inuit for a year, though I underestimated the different dialects, and I was given permission to visit a couple of Inuit communities in Canada's far north. Probably like most scholars, I worried about disrupting people's lives, asking wrong questions, claiming space and time, and extracting culture for my own purposes, what Alexa Wolishin calls being bad kin. Air travel on planes, modified with tundra tires, I'm told, was initiated in Arctic Canada in the 1950s. One Inuit man made a drum dance song about the first airplane he saw. This is an English translation, of course, of a song in Inuktitut, and I decided just to show you the text rather than play it for you. So he describes the first airplane he ever saw as a big bird that frightened him. The drum dance songs are not just when airplanes first arrive on the scene, but throughout history, an Inuit way of recording their history. And in fact, the whole idea of how different cultures write history is something that really fascinates me, and it partly is related to this Inuit experience. The detail with which the land is named, encounters with animals and humans, hunting successes and failures, for instance, events such as the landing of the first airplane, as well as interaction among Inuit people are all recorded in drum dance song texts. That is the history of their culture. You'll notice from these two maps that Inuit people who use syllabics to write things name the land in much more detail than settlers do. Here we are. Okay. One community I got to know was Joahaven, the name referencing the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, whom Inuit had helped to survive when his ship, the Joa, got stuck in the ice there in 1903. Rebecca Kitswalik, the woman that you see on the left of the slide, and was an extraordinary translator in Joahaven, and she worked with me to transcribe and translate texts for the drum dance songs I recorded. I was hopeless at first, but she helped me improve to some extent. The community where I spent the most time, however, as much as my teaching schedule allowed, is now called Kugarak, but was known by the settler name Pelly Bay when I was there. Unlike the long-established Joahaven, Inuit had only settled in Kugarak in the 1950s and 60s, and they still moved around on the land to hunt and fish both before and after settlement. When Inuit moved to permanent settlements, old and new life-wise were clearly both evident. Here you see the stretched skin and motorcycles all beside one another, and similarly, families waiting for groceries. They'd never gone to the store for groceries before, of course. Families were given very small, uninsulated wooden homes nicknamed matchboxes. Each house was heated by a small wood stove that easily might have set the wood house itself on fire. Store managers and nurses and teachers, a lot of them non-Inuit in the 1970s, had more capacious, safer, and warmer homes. Like the Joahaven residents who told me about their interaction with Amundsen, my Kugarak acquaintances had met a famous exploration team as well, led by the Danish explorer Knud Rasmussen. According to the internet, his expedition traveled over 18,000 miles on sled and on foot in the 1920s. I don't know how we could prove that statement or disprove it, but that's what the internet tells us. Among the many amazing people that I met was Elen Karmatsiak. She's here with her husband. She was a young child when she met Rasmussen. Some of the songs shared with me by Elen and others actually reflect on or update information about experiences described in Rasmussen's report of the 5th Thule expedition. That report mentions a man who had been banished from the community because of violent behavior. Among the songs that people graciously let me record in the 70s is one made by this exiled man. It tells of his extreme loneliness and his wish to return to the village. Kugarak residents had also met several film crews. One filming a documentary series in the early 70s featuring this man, Zachary Itamagnek, who was introduced to me when I first came to town as their movie star. Zachary again starred in the 1980s in the Disney production of the film Never Cry Wolf, and this image is online from that particular film. Never Cry Wolf was based on a Farley Mowat book. That might be a name that's Canadians at least know about. I got to know Zachary Itamagnek as a very good drum dancer. More juxtapositions of old lives and new ones. I was concerned about the ethics of collecting, as we probably all are, but one community leader clearly encouraged collecting, perhaps because air travel and settlement in a village were changing Inuit lifeways. Additionally, because children were being taken to church-run schools in the south, the infamous residential schools that took them away from families and disallowed their native languages. I'll speak more about that just in a moment. That Inuit leader, John Mingark, subsequently served in the Nunavut territorial government. But he surprised me when I first arrived in Pelly Bay by taking me to the homes of elders who were the most venerated singers and storytellers, introducing me and even setting up times for me to come over with my tape recorder. Very few ethnomusicologists, I think, have had that kind of experience. It was a surprise to me, and I was very grateful for it. In retrospect, I can see how the songs, some composed as early as the 1920s, were important vehicles that described their lives at a time when resettlement and residential schools were bringing change. They had worked with explorers and movie producers, and so why not a fledgling ethnomusicologist? In addition to the drum dance songs that both men and women sang, there were also gender-specific cultural practices. Some of the most inventive were women's vocal games. The type that many of you may be familiar with is what non-Inuit have named throat singing. I don't know actually who came up with that name, and it's a bit weird, but okay. Here's an example, short example. Come on. Is that loud? These duets feature very close canonic repeats. I don't know whether, if you haven't heard this before or seen it, you don't quite realize, but one woman imitates what the other woman does only one beat later, so it's a very close kind of canonic relationship. And as you can hear, it's often produced deep in the throat. Throat singing has been claimed by some scholars to be the genre of all Inuit, though in the 1970s it existed mostly in northern Quebec. The women I knew west of Quebec also enjoyed making up vocal games, but the styles and formats varied considerably. Here, for instance, is Hélène Carmatsiak, the woman you saw a moment ago in a slide, and her friend Martha Tunnock, playing a less virtuosic vocal game, but one that also tested lung capacity. With each trip north, I enjoyed deeper friendships, of course, and I learned a few ways to reciprocate for kindness and assistance. I got used to occasionally hitching free rides on airplanes or helicopters, though perhaps I shouldn't admit to that in public, learning to enjoy eating dried fish or caribou, and slowly learning some social norms. I took a long time to understand sovereignty. Like many, I associated it with indigenous governance of their own people and land, though ironically this right was granted by the nation-state of Canada. I also thought of it in relation to the appropriation of indigenous stories and images. But the English word does not cover the other ways in which indigenous individuals, hereditary families, clans, nations, may inherit or be assigned responsibilities that are regarded as sovereignty. So sovereignty doesn't translate easily, but one translation I've seen is something like, we care for one another. As you know very well, the impact of fieldwork happens over time. Neither local radio stations nor schools in the North were very enthusiastic when I first gave them copies of recordings. They didn't need them when they had access to the live singers and storytellers. But decades later, an Indigenous school principal wanted all my recordings so that her students would hear the voices of elders who were no longer with them. Again, I suspect that's not an unusual kind of experience in this particular group of people. Of course, I shared my recordings with her, even though the changes in technology for all of us are sometimes making sharing old recordings an interesting challenge. Similarly, the Provincial School Board in the province of Nova Scotia orders each year a CD of archival recordings of Mi'kmaq songs to be available for all of the province's schools. That CD was produced by Janice Tulk at the research center I founded at Memorial University in St. John's. The province's initiative to ensure that a new generation will learn their language by hearing very good versions of songs and classic legends is commendable. Partly because of the huge expense of traveling to the Arctic, and partly because of the Canadian government's research funding regulations, that favor new topics with each application, I shifted my community-based work to First Nations. The Inuit First Nations was available by car or boat in the 1980s. I spent a winter with Inuit Labrador and maintained contact with other Inuit in Quebec. In the 90s, one Inuit duo, Cashton, had broken ground with contemporary music in their own language, and the songs they were writing topped the charts in Quebec. They got airtime on radio stations that would normally not play Indigenous music. Among the other genres of music that Inuit valued very much were Christian hymns. You can see Agat Kiwas here, who was one of the best singers of those hymns. The uses of certain hymns maintain older traditions, especially when people moved away from the mission station to live in tents during the summer. Some hymns were sung as protection while traveling, and inside the tents, hymns were sung while facing the tent walls, as in the old shaking tent tradition. Seeing the pleasure that Agat felt when she sang hymns led me to be much more open-minded about colonial institutions and their impact on Indigenous traditions. However, it also made me think that rather than working in Indigenous communities, perhaps I should be researching colonial institutions. Phase 2, the impact of colonial institutions. Culture loss, as we're all aware, is a troublesome part of colonial history. The abolition of public Indigenous performances from the 1880s to the 1940s was law in both Canada and the US. Equally culture destroying were residential schools, usually run by Christian denominations. The residential schools were established in the late 19th century and lasted until 1990 in some areas. Parents and grandparents spoke about their youth returning from these schools with no ability to speak their language, their own language. English was mandatory. Girls and boys were housed separately, and so even conversation with their kin was forbidden, although the children were clever enough to find ways around some of the rules. The children had to do all the work to maintain the school premises, scrubbing floors, fixing furnaces, or whatever. Inuit acquaintances rarely told me about the cruelty that many children suffered. In 2014, Canada finally addressed the problems of the schools with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I learned more about some of the worst schools, but also the systematic assault on Indigenous languages and lifeways at virtually all of them. Has the TRC had an impact, you might ask? Well, sadly, the Chief Commissioner reported in a recent TV interview that only about 10% of the 97 recommendations made by the Royal Commission have been implemented in Canada. Indigenous families use music in various ways to cope with the impact of those schools. The adult children in one family formed a singing group with their mother to perform the songs she was not allowed to hear or sing in school. A group of men who meet regularly to discuss the lingering trauma and tried to keep themselves also on a healthy journey, decided to write songs and make a CD as part of their recovery process. There are dozens of stories like this, the ways that music became part of the struggle to heal. One Inuit composer stands out for me because of the very powerful way that one of her songs both captures the negatives about the schools and asserts the love of family. Lucy Idlout is an Inuit composer and singer currently living in Cambridge Bay, and she wrote E5770, My Mother's Name, to describe the school's cruel authority experienced by her mother. The title, of course, references the practice of giving children numbers rather than calling them by name. Her song begins with a brief excerpt of her mother's gentle voice as a radio announcer in adulthood. This is interrupted by a loud drum roll that feels sort of like a violent attack to me, as the schools must have felt to these children. Lucy then explains in song how children were identified by numbers, not names. And this song is intentionally unsettling, out of tune, intentionally, but underpinned by throat singing. then the song goes on a little bit to question the future, and I'll just play a part of it, the part I've described. Residential schools were not the only colonial institution with problematic histories, because museum collections of indigenous sound-producing instruments in particular were assembled largely without permission or compensation. The project preceded the more recent hiring of many indigenous curators in museums around the world, and we learned about some of those progressive institutions at the recent SEM pre-conference symposium in Ottawa, if you happen to be there. But way back in the 1980s, I formed a team with two colleagues, Sam Kroc and Francisco von Rosen. We each knew different indigenous communities in northeastern North America, visited 20 plus different museums in Canada and the US in that northeast region. The museums differed vastly from small regional or community-based ones to huge ones, such as Canada's Museum of History, or in the US, the Smithsonian and the New York-based High Foundation, the collection of which is now in the Museum of the American Indian in Washington. We were honored that a prominent Ojibwe elder worked with us to look closely at the photos we took and at our detailed drawings of more than 700 artifacts. Our study had some surprises. The artifacts suggested considerably more intercultural contact than most accounts of indigenous communities in North America acknowledge, for instance. Some instruments, such as this zither, raise questions about contact with Scandinavia, perhaps, since it resembles a Finnish cantilever a little bit. The range of sound-producing material and variety of construction techniques are extraordinary. A drum could be very large or small, rotated with a handle, the Inuit way, or held in the hand or suspended, as the Innu do. The very large Inuit drum on the right was struck only on the frame, the frame that stretched the hide, and that meant that the hide could be made out of various materials. Here it's made out of cloth, which always seemed kind of strange for a drum, but it worked. The very large, the Innu drum on the left had a layered frame, as you can see, that stretched the hide, and a snare with small pieces of bone usually. The snare vibrated when the drum was struck and was sometimes described as a spirit voice. That drum was always suspended. Shakers, often called rattles by non-Indigenous people, are exceptionally diverse. One shaker had a cloth inside, sound-reducing rather than sound-producing. One had no sound at all, intended for use by the spirits, the elders suggested. In many cases, personal biographies were drawn or carved into the instrument. If you look on the top left of the slide, that drawing of a shaker depicts symbols associated with Christianity in part and traditional beliefs in part. But of course it's round, so we don't know which came first or second, or whether they were simultaneous. Drum sticks, and here you might look at the center slides, were made of wood or stone and often had the most intricate artwork, especially the ones at the top. Those are all Haudenosaunee drumsticks, and they're just carved exquisitely. It's amazing. According to a young instrument maker who recently visited my university, this Mi'kmaq shaker was only made of wood so that it could be tossed on the wood pile or in the fire if colonial gatekeepers came to visit. The photos occasionally inspire speculation about amazing new construction ideas, such as a plan to make a string instrument by pulling an animal sinew taut around a tree. To my knowledge, this was never attempted. I'd be happy to stand corrected if anybody ever hears of one. The most important impact of our project was, of course, taking our photographs back to communities. In those contexts, often with school children as well as adults present, elders discussed the instruments, their uses, and sometimes the symbolism of construction. Indigenous audiences, surprisingly, rarely raged about their removal or their association with other colonial institutions, such as the railways that so proudly displayed Indigenous trophies in the early days of colonial settlement in the Americas. Rather than lamenting loss, many Indigenous colleagues and acquaintances believed that the artifacts were alive and waiting a moment of return, and we had helped to expedite that return. Museums, of course, have changed a lot. Many now loan artifacts or open their space and their collections to Indigenous groups or others who may gather to do ceremony in the museum itself. But as mentioned, some museums were nervous as late as the 1980s about opening their Indigenous collections to researchers. One big one initially refused us access. When I noted that we had federal government funds to conduct the research, they gave us access. We published a book, I think this is one that Jonathan mentioned too, Visions of Salad, but a manuscript for a second book, which was a compilation of museum information about all 700 artifacts that we had looked at, did not make it into print. Why? Well, the first museum we contacted for permission to include information about their artifacts said that they required evidence that we had permission from every family who owned the instruments. Their own documentation, however, lacked any information about the individuals or families from whom the instruments were removed, and we had no way of knowing who these hundreds of families were or where they lived. So that manuscript remains a manuscript. Okay. So that particular project, I think, led me to the next. This is kind of how this little talk works. Each thing impacted the thing to follow. And this was the impact of expanding intercultural spaces of dialogues. So while my projects into the 1980s and 90s were concerned largely with traditional cultures, it was problematic for me or other ethnomusicologists to cast Indigenous cultures only as tradition bearers. This is no news to you, I think. New arrangements of music in a wide range of styles and genres were thriving in Indigenous creative worlds. Combinations of traditional and new elements, pop genres, combinations of genres, electronic as well as live ensembles. There was and is a great deal of energy at festivals where Indigenous musicians from different parts of the world were meeting. I turned attention to several exciting festivals hosted by First Nations in North America and got to know the Sami scene in Europe as well. Sami-owned recording production was especially vigorous, and a festival in Norway called Ridu Ridu, it translates as the storm by the sea, annually invited Indigenous musicians from around the world as part of a massive insistence that contemporary indigeneity be appreciated. Inspired by the value of intercultural and interdisciplinary dialogues at festivals, I organized a couple of colloquia with a view to widening and deepening the dialogue between Indigenous culture bearers, musicians, and ethnomusicologists. First Nations and Sami musicians and community leaders were involved alongside ethnomusicologists, some with and some without Indigenous ancestry. So the first of these meetings concerned the trouble with copyright. You know about these things, I think, but here's my take on it. Actually, what we wanted initially to discuss was the responsibilities of song knowledge. And that led us to a dialogue about limitations of copyright law. As we all know, cultural communities worldwide have a troubled history where the commoditization of their knowledge is concerned. You all know about these things: sports logos, canoes, environmental and medical knowledge, and even DNA in the Human Genome Project. But beyond blatant misuse of images, it is also clear that neither clan nor family ownership, let alone the social responsibility of song knowledge, is recognized by copyright, as you know. Responsibilities and law, then, are two very different frameworks for protecting and ensuring the proper use of cultural materials. The colloquium helped clarify and deepen awareness of the distinctions between settler property regimes and Indigenous folky-on responsibility. Clearly, Simon Frith's contention that, quote, there currently seems to be a radical disjuncture between the law and the social practices it supposedly governs, end quote, pertained here. The colloquium ended with a concert by some of the Indigenous presenters, and one told me that the concert itself would demonstrate their alternatives to copyright. Some performers spoke about the lineages of songs they performed, others about gifts of songs. A surprising and lively moment in the concert occurred when Métis Ojibwe Cheryl Lirondell offered a revisionist history of Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land," a song that has often been described as a racist settler song. At least in my youth, I think that was the take on that song. She argued that Guthrie had Indigenous ancestry, though I haven't been able to confirm that anywhere. I don't know. Anyway, singing in her own language rather than English, the meaning of "this land is your land, this land is my land" has quite different connotations, and I'll play a little excerpt.
See
responsibilities of song knowledge was an inspiring intercultural encounter because of the candor of participants. So a few years later, I organized another Indigenous settler colloquium, this time addressing Indigenous modernity, a concept spoken about a lot of Indigenous events and addressed centrally in publications by Indigenous authors. One of the participants in the colloquium has recently published, Jessica Bissett-Correa, a Dene Ina musician and scholar, came out with Sound Relations in 2021, and she draws usefully on the concept of density to consider what she calls archives of presence and resurgence. Similarly, the colloquium presentations considered styles that range from minimalism to performances, including environmental sound in natural settings. One of the keynote speakers, Trevor Reed, Hopi First Nation, discussed how disrespectful behavior of tourists in the Grand Canyon, which is Hopi territory, instigated a very subtle change in a traditional Hopi song. Questions also arose about what guided the choice of styles. How did the sounds of nature incorporated into compositions by Raven Shakan or into a symphony by Sami musician Niels Aslak Valkeapea, for instance, invite a redefinition of composition itself? Again, the conversations were enlightening and impactful according to the participants. So these colloquia led me to think literally about other spaces of learning and dialogue in universities and beyond. How do classrooms shape discussion differently from talking circles, for instance? Would it sometimes be productive to go hiking rather than sit indoors? I'm influenced often by Anishinaabe author, musician, and educator Leanne Simpson, who is one of the many Indigenous thinkers who write compellingly about the land as pedagogy. She offers courses on the land itself, as do quite a number of other Indigenous teachers worldwide. And you can see here that she talks about the fact that a resurgence of Indigenous political cultures, governances, and nation building requires generations of Indigenous people to grow up intimately and strongly connected to our homelands, immersed in our language and spirit and embodying our tradition of agency, leadership, decision-making, and diplomacy. And she critiques the state education system as something that upholds settler colonialism. Having grown up on a 100-acre farm, where I love to explore the many fields and 2 adjacent forests, I relate strongly to the idea of the land as a teacher, though our settler property was likely on Indigenous land. But let's think for a moment about classrooms. Classrooms keep us still and in place. How does this physical space, usually isolated chairs with writing surfaces that more or less contain us, impact thinking and the exchange of thoughts? We can't, of course, blame the furniture. But are there instances where classrooms also contain the rightness of colonial-centered histories learned as progress, as Leanne Simpson asserts? As Martin Daughtry put it in his book, Listening to War, quote, "A sound's salience and emotional charge depends upon the life histories of the people who hear it and upon the comparative backdrop against which they listen to the sounds that are placed in a particular time and location," end quote. I agree with Simpson that classrooms may confine the sonic salience and implicitly deny the connection to homelands. But I have a further question that I'd really like to hear from you on, perhaps after the talk. And that is whether spaces of learning also impact how we learn to write. Do those desks that contain us silence conversation in general? I now examine my draft text with listening in mind, and I'd love to know from you if you write as listeners for listeners. My readers understand long words and sentences, and sometimes the depth and complexity of one's thoughts need long words and sentences, but it is useful to consider how writing with listeners in mind might spark deeper conversation, actual or virtual. And I realize those who speak many languages around the world may have also very interesting views on this particular question. I'd love to know from you whom you have in mind as potential readers when you write, and do you write differently for readers or listeners? I'm getting near the end of this talk. So, impacts that count. Count, in quotes, of course. Count is a loaded word, but critiques of quantitative impact studies are germane. We may have heard some of that at this conference, I'm not sure. Lutz Bornman, a sociologist of science, has identified some of the problems. It's not clear which impact can be attributed to which cause. Impact can be diffuse or complex and contingent. It's not clear what should be attributed to research or other inputs. The international nature of R&D and innovation makes attribution virtually impossible. In many studies, the societal impact of research has been postulated rather than demonstrated. Are those things true of the field of ethnomusicology, I wonder? I did find an online impact study connected quite directly to the subject of my talk today. It concerned the development and changing impact of a thriving Indigenous music industry in Canada. Musicians who provided data for the study worked in many different musical styles, some traditional, some contemporary pop genres. The study did offer statistics. I learned that this culturally specific, Indigenous, and yet really diverse part of our culture industry contributes over 78 million Canadian dollars annually to the Canadian economy. I haven't tried to work that out in other currencies. If you're really interested, you can do it. The study also includes extensive personal statements that indicate quite clearly that money was virtually never the primary motivation for most of the Indigenous musicians involved. Quotes were cited in the study, and many of them speak to impact as they reflect history, motivations, and social interactions. Here are a few of them. No, here are not a few of them. Okay, good. So, music brings about change. We have a responsibility as artists, they said, to bring positive and important messages. Music is healing and medicine. The modern way of life is often misunderstood by non-Indigenous cultures. There's references to intergenerational trauma, to the gathering of cultures and the educating of non-Indigenous people. Keeping language alive is particularly important for many people, and it's important for us to sing in our language, one person said. We prove that our culture is alive, and we make our ancestors dance. Whoops. I really need to show you that just well, we'll leave it there. In conclusion, we can all be grateful for this exceptional conference, for the diverse and sometimes divergent perspectives. Clearly, you didn't need me to encourage you to think of impact as intercultural, interspecies, and environmental. At the same time, I hope I've convinced you that for recipients, impact is usually a deeply personal experience. The stories with which I started this talk are cases in point. They come to my mind because of that deeply personal experience. Car crashes. I lost 2 family members in 2 tragic car accidents 3 years apart, accidents for which my family members bore no responsibility. And of course, climate change. Scientists have tracked this for decades, but it is much more recently when we're feeling the extreme temperatures, the increase in tornadoes, etc., that the general public is more and more impacted by our changing Earth. That issue has become personal. Ethnomusicologists are already taking up some of the challenges of our changing Earth by studying natural sound, but there are many sonic elements that we might study and speak more about. The calls of birds and animals when stress is high, for instance, or the sounds of wind and ice storms in relation to the damage they do. These might become important teachers in an ethnomusicology of sound layers and sound shifts in a changing world. And with that hopeful but completely unsupported supposition, I will end my talk. Thank you for listening.